Let's talk about socialization. In homeschooling circles, we call this the S word because this question has been coming up my entire life. I've been in the homeschool world since 1983, first as a kid and then as a mom. And I can tell you, this is the longest standing objection to homeschooling that there has ever been. So I just want to address everything there is to address about socialization because no matter what, every single day I hear things like kids need to be with other kids or children need socialization or how are your kids going to interact with people or I just want my kids to have friends. So this episode is for the skeptic, the newbie, and the homeschooler who wants a good answer for the naysayers. But first, I just want to set the record straight. Homeschool kids actually don't live under rocks. They do go out in the world and interact with other humans a lot, more than you probably realize. What's even funnier is there are many adults who were homeschooled running around loose all over the place, and you would be surprised because they know how to talk to strangers as well. So I've been homeschooling my kids for 25 years. We started in the year 2000, and I have 5 kids who are currently ages 14 to 29. Over the years of their schooling, my kids have been on homeschool sports teams, in dance classes, music lessons, 4-H, homeschool cooperatives, church youth group, various art classes, science co-ops, park days, field trips, prom. They've been in parades. They've been speaking at public events. And of course, they get part-time jobs when they're teenagers. We talk to the neighbors. We play games with friends. We have company over to our house. My kids have always attended birthday parties. They go to concerts. We eat in restaurants and we shop in stores. We do like socializing our kids, but we really like overseeing this socialization. That's why we participate in carefully chosen, selected small groups of like-minded families where we get to supervise the social interactions. The rest of their time is spent actually being raised by mom and dad in the best possible training situation for real life, which is the family. So let's unpack what socialization is, because I do believe that the home and the family is actually the best atmosphere for social interaction. Interacting with family members is the first form of socialization in every human's life, and I think it gives the best opportunity for kids to learn how to relate to others while they're in a forgiving and comfortable environment like the home. They learn how to do so many things without ever leaving their home, like greeting family members with a good attitude, sharing, looking people in the eye when they carry on a conversation, speaking in complete sentences, learning to complete a task alone and with other family members, learning to share work. They learn to properly greet a stranger at the door, how to answer the phone, maybe to discuss their schoolwork or favorite book, learn how to ask questions and also how to answer questions. Here's a good one. Listen patiently to a toddler or any other sibling who might be rambling on about something that they're not interested in. And hopefully they're learning how to put their phones away and be present with people in the room. So when people bring up socialization, the first instinct of a homeschooler is to give a list of all the things that our kids do. And I just gave you a long list of what my kids have always done. And while that's nice, that's not really the point, is it? It shouldn't be. One of my favorite scriptures that applies to homeschooling in general is from 1 Corinthians 3:19, and it says, "The wisdom of this world is foolishness with God." And that definitely applies to socialization. Why would we answer people according to the worldly standard of socialization when we know that there's so much more to it? Christians don't need to prove that we are just as good as the world. Our children were given to us by God, and His ways are higher than our ways. So homeschoolers are so busy trying to outdo the world that sometimes we forget what God has called us to do. So despite our impressive list of co-ops and sports activities and church attendance and all those other things that homeschoolers actually do, let's talk about the deeper issue of what socialization is. I think when strangers ask about socialization, what they really want to know is, do your kids go outside and play with other kids? Do they have friends? That's it. They want to know whether your kids see the sunshine or interact with other humans. And then homeschoolers laugh because of course we see other humans. Homeschooling doesn't mean prison or basement. It means not going to public school, basically. Well, let's put aside all those curricular activities that we do and look at what socialization actually entails today. School socialization is primarily this: unsupervised interaction with kids you don't know, whose parents you don't know, who carry around little computers connected to the internet. That is my definition of socialization in today's age, and I think it's the most accurate. In the classroom, there's a teacher, but in the hallway and on the bus and in the lunchroom and in the restroom and on the playground and in the locker room, there is little to no adult supervision. So let's leave out bullying and all the terrible things that come with that and just think about what kids do and talk about together. Remember, kids are little sinners just like their parents. They will usually gravitate towards what is naughty. It's human nature. Not every day, not all the time, but yes, children have a sin nature just like you, just like me. And without the moral guidance of a wise and loving parent, these kids are immersed in behaviors that are allowed to grow and fester to become big behaviors. And if you multiply that by the amount of time that they spend in a public school setting, I think you would start to rethink socialization. Kids spend 7 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, over 13 years of their childhood in this kind of environment. So let's ask ourselves, is this the kind of socialization that the Bible instructs us to do? Now, you might be saying, well, I haven't read what the Bible says about socialization. You won't, because the Bible doesn't mention socialization. You won't find it in there, but the Bible is an instruction book for our whole life. So let's talk about what it does say about raising children or about being children. Proverbs 13:20 says that he who walks with wise men will be wise, but a companion of fools will be destroyed. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, be not deceived, bad friends corrupt good morals. So how does God ask us to disciple our children? Well, this is a very common scripture reference that homeschoolers use, and I still think it applies today. Deuteronomy 6:6-9 says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. And here's where he's addressing the parents. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you rise up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. That's basically saying immerse your children in the truth of my holy scriptures. Proverbs 22:6 says to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. So again, we're not going to run across the word socialization in the Bible. But the Bible reminds us constantly that we are all sinners and we do what we know we should not, and that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. If the Apostle Paul was able to lament that he struggled with sin and knowing what was right, but not doing what was right, how much more is that true of our children? So it is our job to protect and defend our children from the worldly idea of socialization. That idea that it's okay to just throw them to the wolves and let them learn the hard way. Don't let the world make you feel guilty because you didn't register for enough programs or because your child spends more time with family than strangers. Go to God's word for your direction, not the world, because again, the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. So let's decide what socialization is and what people believe it to be. We've heard all the arguments. If you've been in homeschooling any length of time, you've heard all the arguments for public school socialization. But if you hold them up to all of the scriptures that we just read, it starts to help you think differently. And I think you can ask yourself, is it really true that kids need to be with other kids? And I don't think it is. They want to be with other kids, and there's nothing wrong with them being with other kids, but you might be surprised to know that kids don't need to be with other kids on a daily basis. Again, that's the wisdom of this world. People all the time will say, well, they need to know how to interact with other people. And in order to do that, they need to go to public school and sit in classrooms with kids their age all day, every day. This is the worst advice I can think of, guys. This is an artificial, forced interaction. And as everybody knows, after graduation, they will never experience anything like this again. It's not even training for the real world. Interacting with people should not be forced. It's already a natural part of life. Just like I said, waking up and interacting with your family is socialization. Even if there's an only child in the house, like one child and no siblings, if they have a parent in the home, they still learn by their example and they still leave the house and they still interact with strangers and friends all over their town and throughout their week. They can learn things together outside the home. I mean, whose kid doesn't wave at the mailman or the trash truck and go in the grocery store, go to church, go in the bank with their parents, go to the zoo, or eat out in a restaurant? All of these things are a natural part of life no matter where a person goes to school. But proper socialization is taught in the home at all hours of the day. When you interact with your kids, you're teaching them proper social skills. Children learn how to greet their family in the morning and to say please and thank you and to listen attentively to all of the things that I said earlier. They learn table manners, or should, in the home, how to play a game together, how to win graciously and lose graciously, and to share their things, and on and on and on. Now, think about the public school classroom or the hallway or the playground or the bus ride. How many of these positive things are actually taught or modeled? You have probably mostly all been to public school, and so I think you know the answer to that. And then think about this. How many negative traits are taught and modeled at the school, in the classroom, in the hallway, and on the playground, and on the bus? So I think if we are honest with ourselves, we have to not be blind to the fact that our children sin. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. That's what Proverbs 22:15 says. We need to be aware of the hundreds of other little sinners who have foolishness bound up in their hearts that your kids are interacting with at school. It's a crowd of children from all kinds of backgrounds, very lightly supervised, tending towards sinful behavior. And no, I'm not just talking about calling names or not sharing toys. Those things happen, but it's much worse today. Don't be fooled. In this internet-driven world, the kinds of sins that your kids are being exposed to are much more sickening than you could ever imagine. Lately, the two most prevalent culprits are witchcraft and sexuality, and they have many forms, but there are others. I live in Texas. It's rural. It's not the big city. You would call this a very conservative area. It's obviously the Bible Belt. And I'm also a local contact for people who are interested in taking their kids out of public school to homeschool. And the stories that I hear are stories that many people think only happen in the big cities, maybe in the ghetto. No, it's happening everywhere. The internet has made our world much smaller. And so living in a small, conservative, rural area doesn't protect your kids anymore. If they have a smartphone, or even if they don't and their friends have smartphones, you can be guaranteed that your kids have been exposed to all kinds of filth because of socialization. There's bullying, there's drug use, there's sexual escapades either being watched or happening. And parents are fooling themselves if they think none of this is true in their town. That is public school socialization. And unless you're super fortunate, it's also private school socialization. You don't escape it just by switching schools. And so when people call me and ask me, how do I get my kid out? It makes me sad. Every time I hear these stories, I think about the parents who put social skills and socialization above everything else, because what they're doing is showing their kids that that's more important than anything. But remember, Proverbs tells us that he who walks with wise men will be wise, but a companion of fools will be destroyed. And this is what's happening in socialization. So, like I said before, true socialization just happens naturally. Even with the most shy person, they are still forced to socialize to get along in life. It doesn't need to be coerced, and it doesn't need to be organized by a public school system. Kids are naturally social. They're interested in what's going on around them. They want to talk to people that they meet, and they do want to play with other children. So as a homeschool family, we can and do facilitate all of this, but we do it in a safer way. So as I listed earlier, we participate in all the things because we want our kids to be well-rounded and we want them to have friends and have a good time. I do believe friends are a gift from God and they're a delight for children. That's what makes childhood fun. But be deliberate in helping your kids have friends and to find activities to do. Make it your point to seek out good friends for your kids, get to know the whole family, organize playtimes at your house, and teach your children how to be good friends. Some of the best advice I've heard over the years of raising kids and homeschooling was that it's very necessary to make the time in your schedule to supervise your children while they're playing with other kids, instead of just turning them loose for multiple hours at a time. Stay within earshot, step in when you need to, and set limits on internet use among the kids especially. Encourage them to do the old-fashioned stuff like playing board games or going outside to play, doing crafts together. Teach them how to have fun without the internet, and also teach them about the fruits of the Spirit, because that makes socialization positive. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. When we practice things God's way, it will seem foolish to the world. That's why homeschoolers are mocked and made fun of, because of some kind of made-up socialization problem. So I just encourage you to turn your back on the world and apply this biblical principle to socialization. Your kids will be better off, and the world doesn't matter. In fact, I always say socialization is one of the best reasons to homeschool. You get 18 to 20 years with your kids, and it's such a short time for you to teach them and train them and protect them. And not only that, you get to spend their socialization years with them. Make the most of this time by guarding their hearts and minds and thoughtfully putting them in social situations that are healthy and good for them. Now, there are a couple of other things that I've noticed in the homeschool world when it comes to socialization. And this one irks me a little, and it also makes me kind of sad. And this is homeschool parents who are afraid that their kids will be weird. But what we're doing when we think this is buying into the very same thought process that if you're not like all the other kids, then you're doing something wrong. And that's not true. Some people want their kids to be super smart, super talented, well-educated, graduate early, and go to college, and also look and act like all the other kids. You've got to choose. It doesn't work that way. The reason that I think homeschool kids, some of them seem weird, is because they are different. But what I have noticed, it's more of an innocence instead of weird. And I guess the world calls that weird. But a lot of homeschool kids are sheltered, and for good reason. They grow up not being exposed to so much of the world's ugliness, while at the same time being able to enjoy life. That's innocence, and I guess the world would say that's weird also. What they're doing, though, is developing their own personalities, and sometimes they're quirky, and that's okay. But they're not being influenced by a classroom full of peers where a leader emerges and determines what's cool and what's cool. These kids get to be who they are. Isn't that what everyone tells us that we should do for our kids, is let them be who they are? But basically what the world says is, yes, you should be yourself, unless what yourself is not pre-approved by the cool kids or even society. Then don't do that, because that's weird. So let your kids be who they are. And if the world thinks they're weird, ignore the world. Little kids do a lot of cool things when they're allowed to be individuals, when they're allowed to be themselves. They hone in on specific interests where they basically become nerds about it. They perfect interests, or maybe they're aloof because they don't want to spend a lot of time in society, so they read for hours on end, or they talk a lot because they're interested and excited about everything. It's who they are, and you can help shape their social skills while still letting them be who they are. You can help them to learn to maybe talk less about themselves, or ramble on for 30 minutes about something that their audience might not be interested in. There's ways to teach manners and social skills without hampering who this person is. They're developing their personality and who they will become. And the end result is going to be a good one. But don't hamper your kids from being who they are just because of what the world thinks. What you're going to wind up with is a kid who has been able to stay away from ridicule and teasing and peer pressure and bullying until they're old enough to handle situations like that. So yeah, there's some immaturity. That's the wrong label to be putting on kids all kids are immature until they reach a certain age. Your kids can develop maturity while still remaining innocent from an intimate knowledge of sinful behavior. I hope that I'm making sense here. There are a lot of kids who are interesting mix of innocence and maturity, and they might be older kids, but they're overjoyed by simple pleasures, and they laugh and they play and they have fun like little kids, but they also have a level of maturity that makes them responsible and understanding and very smart. I know a lot of kids like this, and It's very unlike what you will see in most public school settings. But childhood innocence is something that should be protected and treasured. It's a really beautiful thing. And that is the thing that's missing in this holy grail of socialization in a public school. It's the opposite of innocence. The innocence of these kids is being taken away, and not only by their peers, but also by the school's teachers, by the curriculum, and as I keep saying, by entertainment on the internet. So if you're paying attention to the news today, you already know what I'm referring to. So I just beg you, don't be afraid of thinking that your kids will be messed up because they're raised at home and that they'll be better off being raised by their peers. Let wisdom be your guide. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. Proverbs 3:5-6. And I want to close with this. This is what, after all these years of the socialization discussion and all these, the surface issue, like, well, what do your kids do outside of the home? We've answered that already. But I think the most alarming thing is that homeschoolers are much more concerned, not all homeschoolers, but this whole socialization conversation tends to put more emphasis on friends and playmates without considering worldview. And that's because very few people are even concerned with worldview. I've talked about this in many podcast episodes. You can go back and listen to some with Israel Wayne, Josh Nemi, and a couple of others where we talk about a biblical worldview. But it's just the basic core beliefs that you have and how you see the world. It determines your view of people and culture and politics and morality and everything else. And a biblical worldview shapes your view of every part of life through the lens of Scripture. And so the decisions you make will come from whatever worldview you have, and hopefully it's a biblical one. Why is a biblical worldview important? It shapes everything we do. And if we operate without a biblical worldview, then what worldview do we have? So a biblical worldview is literally the foundation to the Christian life. And one of the things that comes from that is the biblical worldview of parenting and education. And it is our biblical responsibility to train our children also with that biblical worldview. Well, guess who else has a worldview? It's the government schools. People will believe and tell you that public schools are neutral. They're not anti-Christian. They're neutral. They teach raw facts. If anyone's still believing that, let me just tell you, I have some oceanfront property in Oklahoma to sell you when this is over. You can believe that if you want to, but you are being led astray just as quickly as your children. This is probably the attitude of many professing Christians, that education is neutral in the public school, but it's so not true. Nothing in this universe is neutral with respect to God. You are either for him or against him. There is no such thing as a neutral education or a neutral curriculum. And that leads me to the fact that there is no such thing as neutral socialization. When your kids go to a public school, they are being taught the worldview of that school. In the case of government schools, they are very much Marxist humanist institutions. Vodi Bakum quoted a statistic on a video that he's got called "Do You Have a Biblical Worldview?" on YouTube. He said it's no wonder that 71 to 88% of teenagers who identify themselves as Christians in America leave their faith by their first post-high school year. It's a lack of biblical worldview. So this brings me back to socialization, because socialization and worldview go hand in hand. So I mentioned the time that your kids spend in school earlier. For just a minute, I want you to consider how much time your children are socializing with their public school peers. 7 to 8 hours a day, 4 or 5 days a week for 13 years of their life. And then consider how much adult supervision is happening during this socialization. Multiply that times 20 to 30 children that they socialize with all day. What exactly is happening during these hours? If your children and all of the other children are being daily catechized in a secular, humanist, Marxist worldview, they grow up together hearing and believing whatever they're taught. The peer pressure to fit in is very strong. And then compare that to the 1 or 2 hours that most Christian kids spend at church or in youth meetings. And then do the math. Who's influencing your kids? Which worldview is getting the most attention, and what's being cemented into their minds by their peers? If we're honest with ourselves, we know that a companion of fools will be destroyed, and that's what's happening in public school socialization. So to be clear, a secular worldview combined with public school socialization is the opposite of what the Bible commands. J.C. Ryle wrote a classic book in the 1800s called The Duties of Parents. And he said this, "Precious, no doubt, are these little ones in your eyes, but if you love them, think often of their souls. No interest should weigh with you so much as their eternal interest. No part of them should be so dear to you as that part which will never die. The world with all its glory shall pass away. The hills shall melt, the heavens shall be wrapped together as a scroll, the sun shall cease to shine. But the spirit which dwells in those little creatures, whom you love so well, shall outlive them all. And whether in happiness or misery will depend on you. This is the thought that should be uppermost on your mind in all you do for your children, in every step you take about them, in every plan and scheme and arrangement that concerns them. Do not leave out that mighty question, how will this affect their souls?" We should choose our child's education and their socialization with this mighty question. How will this affect their souls? In case you didn't know, in case you didn't hear all the things that homeschoolers do, you should know that a social life is very easy to provide for your children. And in fact, I think in homeschooling, you can provide a much richer socialization for your kids because you have a flexible schedule and many more options to choose from. You can take responsibility for their socialization and give them plenty and still protect their hearts and minds and educate them with a biblical worldview. You can teach them at home and immediately impact their worldview by providing curriculum that aligns with Scripture and taking the time to walk them through the Scriptures, and then seek out quality companions and activities for your kids. Homeschooling is not just a different education option. It is a completely different lifestyle. And if you ask me, it's a lot more fun. I hope that you will see the socialization question much differently after this episode. And if you've ever wondered how to answer the skeptics, don't just answer them with your list of things that your kids do every week, but go deeper and talk about how damaging public school socialization is and how there is a much better way. Thank you for listening to my podcast today. If you want more content like this, you can go to my website at nickitruesdell.com. That's NICKITRUESDELL.com. And find me on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.